Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mark, I'm excited to talk with you today because you have a story to share. But before we get into the story, I have to ask, can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Robbie, thank you. My name's Mark Musick. I'm a retired Major General from the Air Force, and I live in Nebraska. How I got involved with this story was I met a lady in 2002, and her name was Eva McLelland. I was working for a nonprofit, and she made contact with the nonprofit and said, I've got some property I want to leave you guys. So I talked to her on the phone several times. And then I knew there were strangers involved with this, and I knew her husband had just died about 2 months before I met her, which would have been November 2001. So she was fairly much a new widow at this point in time. And when I met her, found her to be a very intelligent woman, very comfortable woman, very um, easy to talk to, shall we say. And she said, Mark, there's something I want to tell you. And I think she liked my military background because she knew I was in the military. I think she liked that and felt comfortable with that. And I said, well, Eva, what is it that you want to tell me? And she said, I was married to Howard Hughes. Now, at this point, I wish I had a camera on my face because it's kind of like, you are crazy, lady. You are absolutely loony. You are crazy. I want nothing to do with you. And I said, Eva, Howard Hughes died 25 years ago. And her response was, that's what they want you to think. And she started in on her story. And her story began where she met a tall, handsome man. She was working in Panama. This was November of 1969. She had a job in Panama, was working there, and she kept seeing this tall, handsome man with AIDS around him all the time, doing business. They met, they got to talking to each other, they enjoyed each other's company. And they did some, visiting together and things like that. And then in December 1969, he disappears. He's just gone. And Eva thought, well, I enjoyed his name. He said his name was Nick Nickley. Nick Nickley. He's gone. In February 70, he returns. They again get to talking to each other because they enjoyed each other's company. And so they get to talking to each other, and she says, Nick, why were you gone? And he said, well, I had some business to attend to in the States. Now, Eva was a very intelligent woman. She knew when to ask questions and when to quit asking questions. She said, well, Nick, while you were gone, I felt like I was being followed. And his response was, you were being followed. We checked out everything about you. Now, that probably didn't leave a very comfortable feeling with Eva, knowing this man that she had just basically met, but enjoyed the time spent with him. March 1970, he takes her to the nicest jewelry store in Panama and buys her a 2 carat diamond ring. They are now engaged. And he says, Eva, there's something I want you to do. And she said, what's that? I want you to sign my name. So he gave her the signature to sign Werner Nicely. Now it's not Nick Nickley. Werner Nicely is the signature. She practiced it, practiced it, practiced it. She says, okay, that's good enough. She signed every document he needed to sign for the next 30 years. She signed them all. He really wouldn't sign anything. She knows there's strangeness going on here in her life. She doesn't know what is really it's all about. They were married in May of 1970 in Panama. Now, the marriage certificate is interesting because his name is spelled wrong. There's a place there for his parents, which are blank, and her age is wrong. They're now married in Panama. She's beginning to put the pieces together of what is really going on here because she's not seeing everything about it. It took her about 2 years to figure out I'm married to Howard Hughes and he's living under this other identity. And then it took about another 2 years where he revealed it to her. And then after that, she could ask him any question. His description He was 6'4", tall man. His hands and his feet were damaged in some way from some accident that he had previously. Of course, Howard Hughes was 6'4", and Howard Hughes was in an accident in 1946 and was severely burned. His hands and his feet were severely burned. A couple things really put the pictures of the puzzle together with for her, and one was in. Let me get the right year here. It was in uh, December 1971. December 1971. They're living in Panama, and he is irritated. He's irritated, and Eva asks Nick. That's who she referred, Nick. What is wrong with you? And he said, there's about ready to be a book come out on Howard Hughes, and it's all full of lies.
Clifford Irving.
Clifford Irving. Eva says, don't you think the public should know about that? Nick now gets this big, huge grin on his face. And it's 7 days after that conversation that there is the media coverage of an interview with Howard Hughes and 7 respected journalists out of Los Angeles. Of course, they could never track the phone conversation. No phone conversations could ever be tracked. What Eva listens to this. This is the big deal now. Howard Hughes is described as a long-haired, long-fingered, drug-addicted, bedridden, mentally incompetent derelict, is what he's described out to the media. However, Howard Hughes is now going to give a radio interview, a telephonic radio interview to 6 or 7 journalists. Eva listens to the story. Eva listens to the broadcast. She recognizes the voice. The voice is Nick. She recognizes this man is my husband. That night, they get back together again. She says, Nick, I heard the broadcast today with Howard Hughes. She said, that was you. And he just smiled. He just smiled. So Eva is beginning to put the pieces to the puzzle together of she's really married to Howard Hughes, the richest man in America. She's married to him, and he's living under this other identity. And then it goes on and on. Her stories go on and on, all confirming the story that Howard Hughes took on another identity, lived as another man, and lived well after the man that died in 1976 was actually a stand-in who was a friend of Howard's who was 20 years older than Howard. The media always say this man, the long-haired, long-fingered, drug-addicted guy, he looks 20 years older than Howard. Well, he looked 20 years older because he was 20 years older. And he's the one who died of natural causes in 1976.
How much information did you have on Howard Hughes before this story?
I knew very little about Howard Hughes. I knew he made movies. He made lots of movies. That would have been in the 30s and 40s. He was also big in aviation. And there was a Hughes aircraft. There's Hughes building aircraft parts, all kind of things like that. I also knew that he had done some aviation records. 1938, he flew around the world. I think 2 days, a little over 2 days, he flew around the world. He set some land speed records on some aircraft that he had built. But that's about all I knew about him, other than the strange last 6 years of his life, which was just really weird, totally weird. But I had not known much about Howard. After Eva approached me with this Howard Hughes story, I began to study up on it and found out, wow, this is strange. Because I'd read books. I mean, he's probably got 50 books written about him. I've read everyone I could get my hands on. I own most of them. And even the books have different information in them, but none of them really try to explain the last 6 or 7 years of his life because you just can't do it. You can't explain it. So they go back earlier in his life and talk earlier in his life. Very, very remarkable, very intelligent man. He only had about an 8th grade education. That was it. He never did well in school. The reason why, he had a hearing impediment, which was genetic. He was bad on hearing, and he used to sit in classroom in the front of the classroom, but he couldn't hear well. So he never really did well in school. Of course, didn't really matter because the guy had all this capability and was a genius, genius mind.
Did Eva ever try, like, did she have any information on Howard Hughes? Did she ever uncover other details about him, like, besides the phone call and putting the voice together, but other details about his life? Maybe the burns on his hands or anything like that that would be very noticeable and kind of distinct with only a certain individual?
That's a very good question, Robbie, because when she was figuring this thing out, she's trying to learn about Howard Hughes and about his life. And so she had read books on him, articles on him, all kind of that things also. And then she did research on him. She had people get her books on Howard Hughes. She went back and also got the medical records of Verner Nicely, the real Verner Nicely. Let's review him a little bit. He was born in 1921 in Ohio and went in the military in 1942, got in aviation and was in aircraft maintenance, mostly in the Pacific during World War II. Married in 1949, I think it was, married in 1949, had a couple boys, traveled around in the military, left the military in 1955. And so Eva went and back and got all of his medical records and all of his military records, which we have, of which she's given me everything to back up this story. So I have all of those records. In 1955, Werner, real Werner, by the way, he was born in 1921 and he was 5 foot 11 inches tall. So all the records say Werner is 5 foot 11. And now Werner Nicely is 6 foot 4. He goes to work in 1955 after leaving the Air Force for the CIA. And he goes to work in Panama doing counter-drug operations as well as other things, counter-drug operations in and out of Colombia, the country of Colombia. The nearest we can put together is he just kind of disappeared about 1967. He just kind of disappeared, but he was working for the CIA. We really don't know what happened to him, whether he was died on a mission, whether he is living under some other identity. We don't know. But I did contact his brother and his son and got further information from his brother and his son about Werner, all matching what Eva had said. He'd gone into the CIA. He was working for the CIA. His brother last saw him in 1960. Their parents died, I think, 69 and 72, something like that. His brother tried to find Werner, could never find him. Werner just basically disappeared. Don't have any idea what was going on with him at that point in time. So then we went and got the medical records of that Howard actually used under the name of Werner, that he spent some time in VA hospitals and VA domiciliaries. So we have those medical records. And then Howard also was in the VA the later part of his life, which was on 1999, 2000, 2001. He was in and out of the VA in Montgomery, Alabama. We have those records. So we have all of this records that all basically confirm Eva's crazy, crazy story.
Now, was there ever an explanation to Eva or something that you came across of why he started to live this other life, why he didn't just keep the billionaire lifestyle? I mean, nobody was able to take pictures of him. He was just a recluse. He could literally do whatever he wanted. I mean, he locked himself, if I'm not mistaken, in a cinema, his own little private cinema thing for like 4 months and refused to go out. And he drank like chocolate milk and chicken. I mean, despite a little bit of tabloid stories that could be inflated or not, that's like a good life. You don't have to interact with anybody if you don't want to, and you have all the money to be able to spend. But living an alternate life after and kind of not faking your own death, but did that person really die? Was there ever an explanation?
The explanation comes in bits and pieces. It's kind of like this 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, of which we have about 600 pieces, but there's still 400 out there that we don't know about. Eva did figure it out. And if you look at all of those things between about 1969 and 1976, you don't know what the truth is, basically. The public has no idea what the truth is there because it was so convoluted. It was so confusing. There was so much misinformation and disinformation thrown at it that you can't tell what the truth is, which is exactly what Howard wanted. It exactly matched his personality. Eva, of course, by that time figured it out. He had revealed it to her. But some of those stories that you hear, take those with a grain of salt because you don't know what's true or what's just totally made up. In 1969, what we can put together on this thing is about the time that Howard took this other identity. He had already changed his looks. He was changing his look so he would look different than what he looked before because he didn't want people to recognize him. In 1969, he was working with the CIA on a project called uh, Project Jennifer, which was to raise a Soviet submarine that had sunk 750 miles northwest of Hawaii. So the CIA, nearest we can put it together, in about this happened in 68, CIA wanted it raised so they could see what's the communication equipment that's on this, what are previous messages that have been sent out, how do they decode them, things like that. So they went to Howard. Will you raise this submarine for us? Howard said, yes, I'll do it. So Howard built the Glomar Explorer, which at this point in 1969 was the most expensive project the CIA had ever done. The books say it's $350 million. I suspect that's low, but if Howard liked the project, he would throw his own money into it. So he would fund also, in addition to what the government was funding, put his own money into it. Richest man in America, you do what you want to do, right? That's how it all works. And so he went and raised that submarine in 1974. Our speculation, and we say this in the book, our speculation is that he said, Mr. CIA, I'll go raise that submarine. You get me another identity. And they got him the identity of a CIA operative who had disappeared, Vernon Isley. Now Nick says, well, I got to add more confusion into this, so I'm going to call this guy Nick Nicoli. So now you have really Vernon Isley under identity of, you have Howard Hughes under the identity of Vernon Isley using the name of Nick Nicoli. So can you throw any more confusion in there? Well, it's probably hard to throw more confusion in. But the identity that he took was a man 5'11", born in 1921. So he would have been 5 years younger than Eva. And now he's 6'4" and 10 years older than Eva. And Eva's the one who says something's going on here, trying to put the story together. She told me about it. It took me 4 years to actually believe her. I just didn't believe her. I didn't know what to believe. I just did not believe her story. And after 4 years, I came to a conclusion, this is right. And then we got all the medical records, all military records, everything backing up her story. We have pictures, everything backing up her story, in which everything she said was absolutely true, but it was certainly not what the public has ever been told previously.
How deep do you think his connections went with the government besides raising a sub? I mean, he's a billionaire. He's an anti-communist. He's basically the perfect profile for anybody in the government at that time that wants someone who can literally do anything with all the amount of money that he has. He's perfect. Despite the Spruce Goose scenario and all that, that really never got it deployed and everything like that, he was obviously contracting for the government. So there was already a pre-existing relationship before the sub thing even took off. I'm just wondering how deep the connections went. I mean, to put you in witness protection, basically.
Well, if you look at other aspects, linkages to Howard Hughes and the CIA, you have the communication satellites. Howard put up the communication satellites for the CIA. Therefore, he used them. You remember that phone call that could never be traced between Howard and the journalists in 1972? Well, they was using the CIA's communication satellites. You're not going to trace them. In fact, the books say no one was ever able to trace his phone communications. Well, it becomes pretty clear he was dealing with the CIA who's using their communication systems. So he could use their communication systems. because they had the stand-in moving from Las Vegas to Bahamas to Nicaragua to Vancouver to Nicaragua. The stand-in with the long-haired, long fingernail guy was moving all these different locations. Howard and Eva were moving different locations, but they all kept in communication. And Howard was really controlling all of this through his CIA command, satellite communications. I have learned that I remember when I said Howard would fund things that he liked. Well, evidently, I heard this off the side that he also funded the Berlin airlift. He helped fund the Berlin airlift. That was 48, I think. But if there's a project out there that Howard liked, he would fund it. If there's things Howard didn't like, he would make it clear that he didn't like these things. And one thing that he did not like was the nuclear testing going on in Nevada. This was the late 60s. Howard owns 6 hotels in Las Vegas, airports, TV stations, acres and acres of Las Vegas, mines. Howard probably owned a quarter of the property of Las Vegas or had leases to it. And what are they doing? The government's exploding nuclear weapons out in his backyard. He didn't like that. He was a germaphobe, for one thing. He was a germaphobe. And certainly he didn't like nuclear bombs going off, that's going to blow nuclear waste anywhere. He didn't like that. And if you look at 1969, Howard went to Richard Nixon and said, quit exploding these bombs. What are you doing? We don't need these things. I don't want to go off in my backyard. Quit doing it.
Was it Nixon or was it Johnson?
It was Nixon.
Are you sure? Because it would have been 68, would have been Johnson.
Well, let me see. Johnson was 60-46. Right. Uh, I don't have any interaction between Howard and Johnson. 69 is when I've got quite a bit of information about Howard interacting with Nixon. So that must have been 69 then. But there was but I don't have any information on Howard interacting with President Johnson. I just don't have that. But there is lots of information on him interacting with Nixon. And if you look at the bomb, there's a bomb that went off in September of 69. And that is the month that Howard left Nevada under this other identity. That is when he left Nevada and went to Panama, was in September of 69, avoiding that bomb. And that's when Eva sees him about 6 weeks later, and then they get in conversation shortly after that. So
Have you
from a timing viewpoint, it matches that bomb going off in 69, September 69.
have you ever heard of the John Wayne stuff that with Howard Hughes?
As far as Howard interacted with John Wayne,
So John Wayne was in a film called The Conqueror. That was a production of Howard Hughes's. 93 cast members on that film set out of the 224 developed cancer and died, and it was because where they were filming their scenes were near the nuclear testing of those weapons. And Howard Hughes became an activist at the start of that to really lobby against nuclear weapon test bans. That's where I know him from. He might have spoke to Nixon. I haven't came across that yet. I just remember there's memos offering $50,000 to the president of the United States to stop nuclear test bans. But yeah, it's just, that advocacy that he had or that thing. I mean, when he left Vegas, like you mentioned, did she ever mention anything about health conditions that come with the radiation or anything like that? Because we know John Wayne died of cancer and a bunch of other people did that were on that set. So I was just curious if he had, I don't know, weird spouts of sickness that she would notice besides the burns on his hands and things of that sort. I mean, if you're married to the guy, you probably notice burns on his back and stuff like that. But what about if someone's puking in a toilet or getting severe headaches or something of that sort?
Robbie, that's a very good question.
It's a
His
weird
health,
question, but
it,
it's a different one.
his health. When they met, she could tell that he was addicted to something, and it was as she found out it was over the counter codeine, cold medicine is what he was addicted to from a painkiller from his hands and his feet and his the damage that he did in that aircraft accident. Of course, this is years later, but there was never any radiation type linkage that she explained to me. He did die in 1993. He had cancer on the left side of his head, and that got worse and worse and worse. He would not do anything about it. And she asked him, "When are you going to take care of this, take care of this?" But the cancer on the left side of his head uh, got worse and worse and worse. And that's kind of one of the reasons why he got his health was so bad and he died in 2001. But we do know that he contracted cancer from that way. Uh, but she never mentioned anything that, and I was not aware of this John Wayne film linkage. No,
It's a
that's new
very
to me.
bad film. It's not a good. He plays Genghis Khan, which is a it didn't work out. It's literally, if you look up the movie, it's ranked everywhere as like the top rated worst film ever. And actually, Howard Hughes bought up all the copies of it to try and I don't know if he watched it. We all know he liked Ice Station Zebra, but
It is interesting on movies. He started making movies in the 30s and made a bunch of movies. But what I've learned on the movies is the more he was involved with it, the worse it did.
yeah.
So if he just let the producers produce and the actors act, the movie came out fairly well. But if he got involved with it, um, it didn't turn out well.
His most successful company was the company his dad made with the drill bit. Everything else kind of ended up crashing and burning just because he micromanaged so much, which is, I mean, if you're a billionaire and you are, he's definitely a take charge person, which I'm just interested if Eva ever expressed an interest deeper after her husband died. If she started looking in and trying to understand, maybe I can learn more about who this person is, or maybe a different side of this person that I wasn't shown.
I don't think she looked at that afterwards. I think she was going through that while she was married to him. Because there'd be times when she couldn't put up with him anymore, and she would just leave for months at a time. She would just leave, but she knew there's somebody always watching her, and there's somebody always kind of protecting her, watching over to make sure nothing bad happened to her. And then they'd always get back together. And if you look at these periods when she was gone, those were the periods that he would go to England and fly airplanes in the summer. That'd be the summer of 73. He'd go to England and fly airplanes. They were gone. There was times when he would do his business dealings. When all the business dealings happened in the books, there are periods when they were gone. So there was a lot of stuff in there that she got tired of his personality because he could go from a very, very charming man to just a verbally vicious man, just very, very quickly. And so she had to be very, very careful on what she would say and things like that. That from what I've learned of his business dealings, he would talk to his about three or four people is who he would talk to, and that was it. But he'd think out loud. And so he'd be thinking of doing something and but he'd think out loud to them. They sometimes took it as direction. He wants me to go do this thing. And then they go and do it. He'd come back and say, "Well, why'd you do that?" And he said, "I didn't tell you to do that." And what he finally told him was, "Unless I tell you 10 times, don't go do anything. I'll tell you 10 times and then I want it done." So he kind of had that uh, trait of going through his mind of what he wanted to do, but it really wasn't necessarily what he wanted to do at all. And so he was hard to work for, but he paid them so well. He paid the people so well that they would never think of going to work for anybody else because they're, making 10 times what they can make at any other job out there.
What were you able to uncover personal items wise when it came to the Howard Hughes life that Nickley might have left behind? Like, did Eva find boxes or find any documentation besides the stuff she had to go find on her own? But just photos. I mean, God, I would have photos of Jane Russell all in my little storage box wherever I kept it. And we all know that was a crush of Howard Hughes's.
Well, Howard had, I think, some pretty good hiding places. Uh, I do have some paraphernalia of Howard's. He always wore gloves. I think for several reasons. They lived out in Alabama. I think for several reasons. One, to keep his hands clean. Another one, so he wouldn't leave fingerprints. And then the third one was hands were damaged. They were burned during the aircraft accident. So, but Eva said he was always wore gloves. We do have one picture of him without gloves, and you can see in that picture that his hands were damaged in some way. We have several pictures of him that Eva took. We have some of his clothes. We have some things like that. We have some other paraphernalia of Howard's that I have, but we don't have a lot of his records. There was a room in their trailer in Alabama that he had his records in, a bunch of records in there anyway. And one day they just disappeared. They were just gone. And so Eva doesn't know what happened to him. But he had a way of things just being gone, just disappearing. And when they're living out there in a very remote area in Alabama, people would come visit him. They would come and they would meet with him. There'd be times when he'd be gone all day long. And Eva said, well, at the evening, Eva said, well, Nick, where were you today? I didn't see you all day long. And he said, well, I fell out of a tree and I lost consciousness most of the day. Well, Eva knew that was a story. That was a line, but he had contact. He maintained contact with people throughout most of the rest of his life while he was hiding away there in Alabama. He was in contact with other individuals.
Why didn't he just say he took a nap or something? That like falling out of a tree and going unconscious is definitely going to demand a follow-up question to that one.
Well, I think Eva just let that go. I mean, I mean, how do you even respond to that one? Before 1976, the man who died in 1976 was a stand-in. He was the friend of Howard's who was a drug addict, and they provided him drugs and so forth to the rest of his life. The funeral was interesting. The funeral service they had for Howard Hughes, richest man in America. Richest man in America. They had a 4-minute funeral. A 4-minute funeral. Who was there? There's about 23 people. There 22 were cousins of his, most of whom he had never even met or could have cared less about. The only other person that was there was a CIA agent, a CIA operative. And obviously, this gentleman's task was to get that body in the ground as quickly as possible, because that body is not Howard Hughes. Get that in the ground as quickly as possible. And it was in the ground in less than 48 hours after his death. It's kind of like it was there and it was buried. Now, there were no aides. There have been aides that took care of him for years. There's no aides there. There's no business acquaintances there. There was no managers there. There's no doctors there who took care of him for years. Nobody. It's kind of like, how do you get this body in the ground as quickly as possible and make the story go away? And that's exactly what they did, was that. So that's an interesting aspect there of the end of his life. And Eva and Nick at this point in time were living in a little house west of Troy, Alabama. I think it's Highway 29, about 8 miles west of Troy, Alabama. Eva now knows I'm married to Howard Hughes. The aides who were always with them through all of this years was living down the road about half a mile in another little house. And the aides would come visit Nick. They'd come visit him and therefore communicate back and forth as he wanted to. they're listening to the radio because you wouldn't let Eva have a TV. He said TVs are worthless. There's nothing of value on a TV. We're not going to have one. So they're now listening to the radio about Howard Hughes's death. And Eva knows this guy died isn't Howard Hughes because she's living with Howard Hughes. So Eva says to Nick, she says, the public's going to realize that there's something very, very wrong with this situation because they're trying to get the body in the ground too quickly. Nick says to Eva, you really know who your friends are when you fake your death and you see who shows up at the service, which was 22 cousins and one CIA operative. So that's their dialogue. After this occurrence now, the aides disappear. The aides go away. There's no longer aides monitoring them. Prior to this, they were going to town. They'd go into Troy, Alabama. They'd have lunch. He'd like to go to the hardware store, so forth. They would go there. I knew the aides were following her because sometimes Eva would go into town, and let's say she had a flat tire going into town. Within 2 minutes of the flat tire, someone would be right there, change the tire, not say a word, and be gone. So Eva knew that there's people monitoring her all the time. And Nick told her, you need to be careful because you could be kidnapped. So she had this I could be kidnapped thing going on in her mind for years. I could be kidnapped because I have knowledge that is important and someone might want Nick to pay for it, pay for that knowledge to get me back. So that's a little bit of the dialogue that was going on in the mid 70s between Eva and Howard, Eva and Nick. And then Nick and his network of business people and control that he's contained until 1976 when the stand-in died.
Did Eva ever explain any other concern for Howard Hughes's reputation from Nick besides the phone call and denouncing the biography, but anything like the Mormon will that ended up coming out with Melvin Dumar? That story, I mean, that's everyone's obviously after. I mean, if you believe it or not, I mean, I'm tend to be on the agnostic side of it. It's an interesting story, fits his personality, but like you mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of stories that come out about Howard Hughes that might be necessarily either fictitious or might have some truth to it, but it makes his eccentric character. But I'm curious if Nick ever really was caught trying to rationalize or explain or deal with a situation that came to Howard Hughes's reputation. I mean, he did have a really good uh, career aviation wise and entertainment industry, and I think we only remember the bad stuff at the end.
Well, there's a couple things come to mind here. Um, One thing is when I started working with Eva on this story, like I said, it took me 4 years to believe it. I just didn't believe it. I just didn't think there's no way what you're telling me is possibly be true. And then I came to believe it. Um, I asked her when we were putting the book together, we were writing the book. I said, Eva, why do you want this book out? And first of all, she said, I don't want it out while I'm alive because she was a very paranoid lady. I don't want it out while I'm alive. So we had to wait till she passed away, which we did. But I asked her, why do you want this book out? And she said, that funeral activity in 1976 was such a disgusting event. That was so disgusting that the public needs to know what the real truth is about Howard Hughes, the genius. And that did not do it. And so that's why we put the book out because Eva wanted basically the truth out there. And everything in that book is true. We speculated in there, but we say we're speculating. But everything else, there's nothing that's not true in that book. That's not what the public's been told. The Melvin Dumar, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a weird story in itself. The story behind that is that December 1976, no, I'm sorry, 1967. December 1967, Melvin Dumar was traveling into Las Vegas and finds a man along the roadside. Randomly finds a man along the road. It's cold out. It's very cold. If this man would have stayed there, he would have probably frozen to death. Melvin gets him in the car, takes him into Las Vegas, and they don't have a whole lot of interaction there, but there's some. And the man ultimately says, "I'm Howard Hughes," to Melvin Dumar. Of course, Melvin's probably thinking, "Yeah, sure, sure, you bet." Going in, he drops him off at a hotel there, and that's the end of it. Howard now dies. The story goes like this: there's someone, Melvin's working at a gas station up in northern Nevada or Utah. I don't remember exactly where it was. Working at a gas station, and someone brings in a document and leaves it on the counter, and it's ultimately a will, a Howard Hughes will. And then there's a story that's made up about it. Melvin comes to the court and tries to explain what he did, and he lied. He just lied about it. Well, nobody believed him. If he'd have probably told the truth, maybe someone would have said, might be some truth to this, but that's not what he did. And about this time, 30 people were coming forward with wills. The country's looking for who's got the will of Howard Hughes. So 30 people come forward and say, "I've got the will of Howard Hughes." The courts rule none of these are legit. None of them are legit. Therefore, he dies without a will. Therefore, the money in his estate, richest man in America, he's got a pretty good estate, goes to who? The 23 cousins who were at the funeral. The cousins now fight for decades over that money. What we don't know if this for sure, but we think that will, that Melvin Dumar will, that Mormon will is the one that Howard wanted. We think that's the one is the one that he wanted because there's some things that kind of lead you down that path. However, Melvin lied about it. The courts can't decide anything that's legit. And it went down a path of cousins, here's your portion of the money. I think the IRS got the biggest portion because Howard, wasn't intended on paying taxes to anybody.
They always get the biggest portion.
So I think the IRS got the biggest portion. The lawyers then got the next portion, and the measly, millions that were left over went to the cousins. That was interesting because history says Howard had no children. History said Howard has no children. Well, one came forward named Cindy. She's in the book. We have two children in the book. One came forward, Cindy, and she actually tried to introduce papers into the court that, hey, I'm a biological child of Howard's. What about me? And her papers were stolen, disappeared. She lost all evidence that she even existed. So when the truth comes forward to enter that into this court dealings, they are just shunned. They are threatened and they are taken out of it because the 22 cousins, got the money. Basically, that's how it all turned out. This doesn't represent a very good picture of our court system. This Howard Hughes at all. He doesn't represent a very good picture of our court system. It's pretty ugly what
Without being
resulted from that.
kind of nefarious about it, but do you think that it was somebody involved in one of Howard Hughes's companies or businesses that was being able to mess with the courts a little bit I mean, how could you have this much where so many people are just denying, 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 and it can't be on the essence of everyone's trying to come out of the woodwork for money. You can't, for a court to rule that on so many cousins and rule that on people that might be coming out with documentation. And I've noticed this. I saw the Melvin Dumar story has been making a kind of a 180 from its original decision of it being false, to now it possibly could be true and it was written off a little too early. And I go, there had to be someone that was working in either one of his corporations that was not interested in having his estate or any of these types of financial gains that Howard Hughes has go to some random person. They probably would want it for themselves.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to speculate on that because I don't know the details of it. But I do know that if Howard wanted influence, he just bought people off. He just bought people off. And it's happened time and time and time again. And that's how he got influence. He had the money to do it. The government was behind him. And that's what he did. But I don't know any specifics on that.
Eva ever express any hobbies or interests that Howard or Nick had that might have been similar or might have just been extremely different? Like, did he still keep the germophobia?
He was a germaphobe his whole life. Yes, all through the end of his life, he's a germaphobe. If they would go walking, let's say in a parking lot, and there was an oil stain there, he would say, Eva, stay away from that oil stain. Just stay away from oil stain. So he was a germaphobe all his life, and she picked it up also on that. As far as hobbies, he liked mechanical magazines and he liked tools. He was a mechanical guy. His mind worked mechanically. And so he would buy tools and things that he liked to use. And Eva said they're always of the highest quality. But he liked, and he would talk about um, engines, airplanes. He'd talk about trucks. He'd talk about anything mechanical to anyone who would talk to him about it. There's a neighbor there who would relay that he loved to go talk about truck engines. And he was a genius. I mean, he knew everything there is about truck engines, but he also was very knowledgeable of aircraft design. He designed his own aircraft. He designed multiple aircraft, and he was a consultant to the government on designing aircraft also. So he had a very, very mechanical mind that was used to benefit those projects that he appreciated or that he thought should be moved forward.
When did
But
you
but 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 I'd say a hobby was machinery. He loved understanding machinery.
when did you drop this story on Doug's desk? Like, what was his reaction to that when you were able to be like, "Hey, I got a story for you." I don't know if you ever heard the name Howard Hughes, but
Now that's a really good question. I came to believe her in 2006, and I started putting the story together. I started writing the story together, and it was so many different aspects of it. There's about five storylines running parallel through this whole mixture, and I was having problems interacting at all. And so I told a friend of mine who was in the military about what I got and what I was trying to do. And I said, I need someone to help me intertwine all of these stories. And he said, well, I might have an idea. And so he introduced me to Doug Wellman. So went to Doug, spent an afternoon with him in his house. And we spent 3 hours together. The first 2 hours, I just told him what I had. And he looked at me respectfully, but skeptically. This is wild. This is crazy. And so just talked about the story the first 2 hours. Then the third hour, I brought all the documentation that I had, the manuscript, the medical records, the military records, everything that I had that backed up this story. And Doug said, let me look at these overnight and then let's meet tomorrow at 10. So we went and met the next day at 10. And Doug said, okay, I understand you're looking for someone to help you integrate this story. And I said, yes. And he said, I'll do it. And I was shocked. To tell you the truth, I was shocked. And I said, what convinced you? And he said, it was your documentation. He said, You can't make this stuff up. He said it was your documentation that did it. And then he and I started interacting and putting it together. There's times though, there was one time I would go to Eva, who living in Florida, and read the book to her because she wanted to make sure everything was accurate in the book. So I'd go read the book to her, and then she'd tell me, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, correct this, this, this. But one time I went and said, Doug, you've got to come with me and meet this lady. You have to meet her. And so I flew in there, he flew in there. We spent a day with her, basically a day with her. And Doug actually tried to trick her on some stuff. He tried to pull her off story. He tried to do some things that was just, would pull her off. And you couldn't do it. She always came back to the same story. It was never ever changed. Even words interaction never ever changed with her. And she relayed a story. She said one day I was out on the ranch, they called it, Wooded Acres, west of Troy, Alabama, in the middle of nowhere. And a helicopter came over and stopped hovered right above me. And I waved at them. They waved back. And I had a camera, so I took a picture. And a little later on, they went over. There's a clearing area to the south of their acres. The guy landed, and Nick went over and interacted with him. And Doug said, I can accept everything going on here except that. I can't believe that. It's just too much. It's too much for me. And so came back to my house, of which I had kept all these documents and all these pictures that Eva had taken. I had boxes and boxes of my own. So I started going through these pictures, seeing, was there a picture of a helicopter? And lo and behold, here it is. So I had the picture of the helicopter. I scanned it, sent it to Doug, and said, Doug, you remember when Eva said that she took a picture of the helicopter that day? Well, here it is. And Doug said, you can't make this stuff up. It's just too wild to consider it any other way than being true. But it's totally, totally different than anything the public's ever been told.
I think what you guys have uncovered is it's insane. I wish people knew more about Howard Hughes because you would have a large interest of people, at least from my generation. I'm surprised we don't really know about Howard Hughes. I'm surprised that took me to the age of 26 to figure out, oh my God, there's this eccentric billionaire that lived this life like any Marvel movie or anything you want to say. But for you, have your perspective or interest in Howard Hughes changed at all after all this?
Uh, my um, my interest in Howard, of course, has increased. I refer to him by first name, like I know him, even though I never met him. So my perspective on Howard has changed because I had this huge knowledge base of how he lived, how reclusive he was, what he needed to do to escape, what he did to escape, how he lived afterwards. I've got the whole picture there of it, but it's hard. Believe me, it's hard to put together. His last official picture was taken in 1954. And after that, he just basically, I've only seen, I think, one other picture of him after 1954 that is a real picture of Howard Hughes. And that was taken by accident by somebody that I saw that. So this was just a reclusive man who wanted to hide and had the money to do it, had a lady who loved him, kept the secret. Um, but there's things that what my perspective on this has become, I don't believe anything on the media. I just don't believe
That's
it.
a good point. That's a very good point.
There's just so many things there that you don't know what's true or what isn't true. And it's almost like there's more on the media that comes through that's not true or that's spun in some way that is on the edge of unreality. But the public has no idea. The public just has no idea how careful you've got to be on what you see on TV.
Well, Mark, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. I really do. I'm glad I was able to talk with you and Doug about your book. I think it's fascinating. I'm going to link it in the description for people, but can you tell people where they can find any of your links that you'd like to promote?
Probably the best place to buy the book is on Amazon. Just go directly on Amazon, Google Boxes of Sleep for Life for Howard Hughes. My name's Mark Musick, Musick. You can throw that at Doug Wellman, Wellmin. But pull that up and read it because it is not what you've been told. It's history that you have not been told. And what we have learned since then is there's multiple occurrences of history that are just absolutely wrong. And they're still occurring all the time.
Well, Mark, thank you again. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blanket. Stay tuned for our next episode.